Super. Ich höre gerade, wir können loslegen. Das ist super. Dann
Great.
sage ich
I was
herzlich
just
willkommen zum
informed
Brüsseler
that we can
Mediengespräch zur
start. A
Zukunft
very
der
warm
Regulierung im
welcome to
Mediensektor.
our Brussels
Ja,
Media
das Thema
Talks,
ist, welche
Future
Inhalte
Regulation in
werden
the
wem in
Media
Social Media
Sector.
Feeds
The
angezeigt,
question is,
welche
what
nicht und wie
should be
kann Europa
regulated and who should do it? What
Hasshetze
can
und
Europe do
Desinformation
to
vorgehen,
do
ohne
something about
gleichzeitig
hate
funktionierende
speech
Strukturen der
without
Medienkontrolle zu zerschlagen? Und für uns sehr
infringing with
Fragen und Dinge
existing
zu besprechen.
structures
Und ich
of media
begrüße
control?
erstmal
And I
bei
would
uns in
like to
der Runde
welcome
Dr.
today's
Anna Herold.
panelists,
Sie ist
Dr. Anna
Referendarin für
Herold,
Audio und
Head
Immersive
of
Medien in der
Unit
Europäischen
Audiovisual
Kommission.
and
Herzlich
Media
willkommen. Herzlich
Services
willkommen auch
Policy in the
Katharina
European
Ebert,
Commission. I
des
would also
Europäischen
like to
Parlaments
welcome
und Mitglied
Petra
im Ausschuss für
Kamerevert,
Kultur und Bildung.
our member of the European Parliament and cult member. I would also like to welcome Heike Raab, State Secretary in the State Chancellery of Rheinland-Palatinate and representative for Europe. Eva Maria Michel, Legal Director and Deputy Director General WDR. Dr. Tobias Schmid, European Commissioner of the Media Authorities and Chair of the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, ERGA, and the National Media Regulator in Europe. And I would also like to welcome Klaus Grevenich, RTL Germany Head of Media Policy. My name is Eva Katharina Lindenau, Managing Director of Phoenix. Now, I would like to inform you that we'll record this event and plan to publish it on our website. I look forward to sharing this moment with you. Please ask your questions in the chat. You're all familiar with the chat function by now. And now I would like to hand over to Dr. Matthias Cornelius.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the organizers to our 21st Brussels Media Talks. The organizers are the representation of the Land of Rheinland-Pfalz in Brussels, WDR and ARD, represented by State Secretary Heike Raab and the Deputy Director Eva Michels, and the Mainzer Media Institute, on behalf of which I talk. The number of people who subscribe for this meeting underscores that this is a very important topic: who is to regulate and what is to regulate. We had to organize this meeting on a digital platform, but on the other hand, this allows us to reach more people than it would have been possible in person in our Brussels office. I would like to share a couple of ideas with you to introduce into the topic, but to leave the other aspects to the panelists. Digital transformation of information and communication processes in societies on a worldwide level has reached legislation of the European Union, which has developed a high level of productivity. In different areas of legislation and regulation, the major platforms have been addressed by European legislation. With the DMA and DSA, we enter a new dimension. The competitive relationship between the EU law and already existing legislation for platform and media regulation in the member states can be a problem, and this leads to our discussion. It's clear that the new EU law will limit the discretionary powers of the member states. The European Media Freedom Act and other initiatives make it clear that the restriction of the European Union with regard to EU media policy is way of the past, because we will discuss today how much the already existing or planned regulation initiatives and legal acts of the EU make sense. And with regard to the new Social Media Regulation and Digital Services Act, one can be of different opinions. But before all, we will have to deal with the question whether the centralization intended will harm the prerogatives of the member states and is compatible with the primary law principle of the EU, and where if we can find solutions. Whoever has discussed the European legislation competence knows that delimitation of competences can be difficult, and for example, the laws on and acts on competition regulation can be used for very different purposes. And the autonomy of the member states had been respected in the past with regard to media law. Whether the new role of platform economy in terms of information in our societies justifies a shift of competences towards the EU is a very important question. This is also true with regard to the worrying development regarding the freedom of media in some member states. But this entails the question whether this justifies a regulatory competence of the Union. So we need to clarify the legal aspects of the problem of division of competences and allocation of competences. It's very important that Dr. Kohl, Dr. Ukro, and Christina Etteldorf have accepted the commission of the Broadcasting Commission of the German Länder to write a study on the allocation of competences in the media sector, taking into account the measures to safeguard media pluralism. Mark Kohl will share the results of this study with us and define the legal framework for our panel discussion. So I can only wish ourselves a very interesting and fruitful discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about the results of Dr. Kohl's study. And I pass the floor to our host, Eva Katharina Lindenau. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cornelius. You mentioned the expert opinion by Mark Kohl from the Institute for European Media Law, and I now look forward to hearing more about his study on the allocation of competences between the EU and its member states. Welcome, Dr. Kohl.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lindenau, and thank you very much, Mr. Cornelius, for the introduction into our discussion. You already have mentioned some important topics. I'm very grateful to all the organizers of this discussion, including the Mainzer Media Institute, that they have organized this meeting and they didn't postpone it despite the problems we have with COVID and that we have to do this digitally, because we are really on a crossroads with regard to discussion on the Digital Services Act. Next week, the Council shall adopt the text which has been elaborated, so we are standing at a crossroads and we can expect important decisions which will define our situation for the decades to come. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share the findings of my study with you. To do this, I start to share my screen. Okay, it works, so you can see what I see on my screen. The allocation of competences. Oh, I see that you are smiling. Does that mean that you see or that you don't see the presentation? Okay, now I can see it. I think that was just a delay. So, the title of the study on the allocation of competences between the European Union and its member states has already been addressed, but the subtitle is important. What are we talking about? We are talking about this comprehensive publication, and before I look into this publication together with you, I would like to say why I'm so grateful that we at an Institute for European Media Law had the opportunity to organize this study, because one could say, okay, the allocation of competences between the Union and the member states in general or in the media sector is not a new topic. For example, in the European Union, since 1989, we have a television directive, and already in this framework, there were questions concerning the constitutional prerogatives of member states. And this is also a discussion we have on a national level between the federal level and the German Länder. Nonetheless, we felt that 3 decades after the first attempt to regulate media by the EU, the time has come to really study the situation A to Z. And you can see on the title page that this study was published as a bilingual publication in German and English, because English, despite the Brexit, is still the lingua franca of the European Union. So allocation of competences between the European Union and its member states in the media sector. But I will share our findings with you in German. We have a very interesting panel which will discuss the consequences of the theoretical findings. So I can be short. I just want to highlight the most important findings. But for those of you who want to know it in more detail without having to read the entire publication, there are several possibilities. For example, on the website of the Broadcasting Commission of the German Länder, you find an executive summary and a podcast on the study, so you can listen to the findings sitting in your car when you listen to the podcast. We had organized a couple of webinars to introduce the study. So if you like, you can find the links to the different websites and podcasts on the slides. And 2021, the study was published in English and German, and I really recommend you to buy and read the study, but it will take some time to read it. I will give you an overview today, so I would like to start with the different chapters and then dwell into more detail on different chapters. We start with the background of the study, but this already is an important aspect because the current European Commission has started a very ambitious program to make Europe fit for the digital age. And this ambition versus the possible tensions between the regulating powers of the member states are the background of the study. What is then interesting is to discuss the primary law framework. The member states have created the European Union based on certain rules laid down in the treaties with fundamental values and objectives of the Union. A very important aspect which we have been discussing for 2 or 3 years now, and with a stronger focus that we have to evaluate certain member states to understand whether they still are in line with the EU values. So we look into the question whether there are competence titles for the European Union to start regulatory work in the field of media. One could believe that, okay, it's super. If we have a set of rules and a treaty, then there are no open questions, because it must be clearly laid down who is in charge, EU or member states, who has the legislative power. But there are shared competences, which creates situations where either one can be responsible. So the question is whether in primary law, primary EU law, you find enough reason to clearly define if the EU is responsible for media regulation. In the third chapter, we look into the significance of media pluralism. Who is responsible for safeguarding media pluralism? Is there a recognition of the objective of media pluralism on the European level? So we have discussed the fundamental rights and freedoms and EU competition regime. In the next chapter, we look into the so-called secondary legal framework. So the different legal acts the EU has promulgated in recent years and which have an impact on media, and have an impact on media pluralism are studied under this aspect, under this chapter. This includes laws and acts and directives and regulations, as well as communications by the Commission. Another chapter, which I will not discuss today, studies the relationship between our question and the core problems of international law, because the legislative powers of the EU have to take public international law into account with regard to regulation of the media sector. And this also concerns enforcement aspects. So this is a very theoretical field of tensions, but it will not be discussed today, but it is being dealt with in one chapter. And then we discussed the Digital Services Act, which has not yet been published at the time of the study. The proposal for a Digital Services Act could not have been taken into account in the study because the study was completed in October last year. So we knew more or less what we had to expect from the Digital Services Act, and we checked how far our theoretical findings can have an impact on the DSA process. And the final chapter contains conclusions and political options for action. I will not talk a lot about this aspect because we're the most competent speakers, and panelists will have their say after my presentation because they are now in the process of accompanying the process of the DSA adoption between Parliament, Member States and Commission. Today, we take a closer look at certain main conclusions in a couple of minutes, and hoping that this will be of interest for you and will provide a basis for a discussion. Concerning the primary law framework, one could say if there is a competence catalog in the primary law, this clarifies everything. But under primary law, there is no competence to define one's own competences. That is to say, neither the Commission nor the Union can define its own competences. There must be a legal basis, and only the competences allocated to the Union by the Member States can be used by the Union, and there is no mention of media regulation. But this alone does not answer the question who is in charge, who is responsible. It's important to note that we have a convergence of media, a significant change brought about by the digital change, and we have a stronger integration of this community of democracies. But EU regulation is only possible if the EU has a clear competence for regulating. But the member states never have introduced a so-called exception culturelle, a cultural exemption. There is no clause saying that in terms of in the field of culture, the EU has no competence to regulate. So there is no clause blocking the possibility to transfer the competence of the Union in economic terms to the media. I use the traffic light as a symbol. I was skeptical whether I use this traffic light symbol because it can be dangerous, because the traffic light is also a symbol for the current coalition between three parties in Germany who are. Or is this to be understood in the framework of COVID measures? I just use the traffic light symbol to say that we have green light for some aspects and red light for others. I take a short break because I learned that there are some bandwidth problems. No, it's okay. So the Commission is allowed to legislate and has green light when it's about the single market or competition. But the media have a double role. They are a cultural asset and an economic asset. So they also play a role for opinion building in the political discussion. So the question is whether this double function or double character of media, being a cultural asset and an economic asset, we can find a justification for allowing the Union and the Commission to regulate more than in the past. So everything which has to do with the single market always means green light, and this refers to DSA and DMA as well. On the other hand, and here we have the yellow light, where the EU has also to respect and protect national competences. For example, there is the principle of subsidiarity and the principle of proportionality. So the action of the Union has to be limited to the absolute necessary, and there are also limits defined by the culture clause of Article 167 TFEU. So far for the theory, but where it can be problematic, where we might see a red light, is the possibility for conflict. Of course, we have the primacy of EU law in the Union. That means even when we can ask ourselves, even when it's not clear whether the EU has competence to act, once the Union has adopted a law, there is primacy of EU law. If and limits can only be defined by a beyond powers check by the German Federal Constitutional Court, which can, for example, state that the EU acted beyond powers. But this is just the emergency brake. What about media pluralism? It can be dealt with in very simple terms. The freedom of media, not only the freedom of opinion, but the freedom of media and the diversity and pluralism of media is enshrined in EU law and particularly protected by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. But this is also a result of the case law promulgated by the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. And this has an impact on fundamental freedoms. So, the fundamental freedom of the media contains a defensive law component and a positive law dimension, which gives member states the responsibility to guarantee the safeguarding of diversity. The member states. And this recognition that the allocation of competences benefits the member states in that case. And this means that member states can limit fundamental freedoms when this is necessary to pursue a goal of public interest, that is to say, media pluralism. And within that framework, they have room to maneuver to define their own laws, but limited by the principle of proportionality. So they cannot just ignore the free movement of services, they have to take the principle of proportionality into account. But one should not forget the following when it's about diversity, safeguarding diversity. The EU competition regulation limits market power and the exertion of governmental influence on economic competition, but does not limit power over opinion and governmental influence on opinion making. This is the core of media pluralism regulation, which is not part of the EU competence, but of the legal framework defined by the member states. EU competition regulation can have a reflectory impact. This is beyond discussion, which is acknowledged, for example, by the concentration control law. EU competition law explicitly recognizes discretionary powers in terms of culture policy, for example, in the field of concentration control, despite the fact that concentration control is a responsibility of the Commission. The same rule applies to state aid. Let's move on to the secondary law framework, which is a good basis for the discussion we have to lead. On the secondary law level, along with the Audiovisual Media Directive, we have had several regulations in recent years which have an immediate impact or immediate impact on media. For example, the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market, or the Telecommunication Regulation, the European Electronic Communications Code, EECC, or the Platform to Business Regulation, that is to say, a regulation which regulates how companies or businesses can address platforms when it's about ranking questions, for example. But all these regulations have a focus on economic conditions, how to make the single market work better. Initiatives to regulate the distribution of content are a different chapter, when the question is how can we fight hate speech, disinformation, illegal content. Up to now, and I would like to underscore, up to now, these regulations are limited to support and coordination measures, because the Commission has clearly signaled that there will be more to come, and this cannot be limited to recommendations or communications or a code of conduct to be respected by the businesses. No, there will be hard regulation in this field. Cultural policy approaches can be found in several of these regulations when it's, for example, about the promotion of European works, which is something we have known for decades now, but also the visibility of public value offerings, which goes beyond the mere economic aspect. So there is potential for conflicts, and here's the green light. This potential conflicts can be solved if we define discretionary powers for the member states, like it has been done in the EDAP, MFA, or other regulations, or the merger control regulation, or in the communication context. Without clear rules about the discretionary powers of the member states, the danger is that there will be conflicts with regard to the legally uncertain interpretation of the rules. It can be unclear whether a member state has the power to act despite the fact that there already is a regulation. And I see the biggest problems to come in this area. Particular attention has to be paid to safeguarding the competence of member states, because this is difficult if the media sector is concerned, for example, with regard to DSA or DMA. This is not a regulation for the media sector, but DSA and DMA will have an impact on the media sector and their role when it's about the distribution of content. For example, there is a regulating function of the Audiovisual Action Plan, of the EDAP, and of the MFA, and others, and especially with regard to the Media Freedom Act, which we'll discuss in more detail later. The question is whether this traffic light will not show red light instead of yellow light, because this has an impact on the core of regulation and the discretionary powers which lay with the member states before. And let me come back to the Digital Services Act. Of course, there is potential for conflicts with regard to the media regulation of the member states. We saw 3 of them when it's about the information and transparency requirements, for example. The transparency requirements with regard to media intermediaries were integrated into the German legal framework for electronic media, and the question is whether there is conflict between EU regulation and already existing regulation by the member states. Next potential conflict concerns obligations with regard to the control of illegal content and with regard to creative leeway of the member states. We saw that the DSA does not clearly define whether media regulation by member states will be possible. I do not have the possibility to share our findings on the DSA with you in much detail, but we have published another study after the publication of the DSA project. You see the link to the study here, where we have discussed the different potential conflicts on behalf of the media agency of the German Länder. But I would like to say that we see a need for discussion in the legislative process with regard to the question whether self-regulation or co-regulation is the key. I see problems with regard to the effectiveness of execution, that is to say, of enforcement. And we have to pay a lot of attention to avoiding, to not harming the effectiveness of enforcement when we create a horizontal agency. And we want to know whether the special needs of the media sector are taken into account. So let's go back to the traffic light symbol. A traffic light can regulate the traffic flow, but it has to be in the right position. So some things, if we have a green light, then we can start to act. But if we see a red light, then we can discuss what is about the distribution of content online. The question is whether DSA regulates this in a satisfactory way, and the allocation of competences between the EU and the member states. We should move in the green light or yellow light area and not in the red light area. So the potential conflicts have to be identified, and the need for regulation must be identified. When we discussed about the intermediary regulation by the German Landesmedienanstalt, we already had this discussion. So we saw the danger that there are problems and difficulties which must be taken into account. We must really identify potentials for conflict on both sides, member states and Commission. We have to discuss the impact of the regulation of the platform economy, so DSA, DMA, the impact of this regulation on the media sector. This is a central question. We cannot pretend that we can regulate the platform economy, leaving the media sector unconcerned. And creating a legislative framework in the EU is the next question, which is only possible if the values of Article 2 of the EU Treaty are respected and the allocation of competences is respected. And there I see in particular the following question as a central question: how can we make sure that we maintain the possibility for member states to safeguard pluralism, because we think that the best place to regulate pluralism is the member state level. So we need gradual integration architecture or regulatory architecture. In the European Union, we have a whole set of regulations which have an impact on the media sector. Then new building blocks, partly horizontal acts, shall be put on top of this, the DSA, DMA, maybe a Disinformation Act or whatever. And this has to be put into the framework of the member states, who are the basis and the foundation of the European Union. Having said this, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kohl, for this very interesting contribution and the summary of your study. Those are the questions that we would like to discuss today. Now, I think you need to stop sharing your screen. Then we'll be back together. And again, I would like to welcome all listeners and viewers. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function. Now, we've heard several aspects of your study. Now, we've heard that Ms. Hoven asked for a stronger control of Facebook, being a former employee. And she was saying that we need to do that in order to make sure that we can protect freedom and democracy in the future. Ms. Kammer-Ewert, what would you say? What needs to be done at the European level? Well, I do think that the DSA can be a good approach, especially when it comes to controlling market powers of large platform operators that are located outside the European Union. And that's why I would like to thank Mr. Cole and his two co-authors for showing the possible problems that can come with such a regulation. Now, when it comes to media freedom, in my perspective, the DSA does not go far enough. When we look at proposals coming from the European Commission, we've noticed that many times it's the perspective of the single market, of the private sector, but not necessarily complying with the needs of the media sector. That is why I'm a little concerned, and we'll see if I'm right in being that. What can member states then do in the future? What's going to be the relationship with existing regulatory measures? We have already set a structure for protecting us against hate speech, disinformation. So with a sector-specific directive or regulation, what's going to be the relationship to the existing structures? What possibilities will member states have in the future in order to implement specific measures? What can we do once we have such a sector-specific media regulation? What about Facebook and others? Will they then be able to just delete or block content? So I think those questions have not been discussed enough, and I'm afraid that that's going to be the case in the future as well. And I'm sure that Mr. Schmidt is going to talk about national authorities and their role. Well, yes, thank you. We will talk about more specific questions later on. Now, Ms. Raab, why is it that important to have a unified European framework before we can look into the different problems when it comes to regulators, etc.? Well, hello, everyone. The European Union is a union of values. It's about democracy, and media pluralism, I think, is one of the most important pillars of this union. And let's stay at that abstract level for a moment. Media pluralism and media diversity, of course, brings about a great challenge. First of all, the platform economy, platforms coming from the US, from China, platforms like TikTok. Those platforms have an impact in how things are being controlled and administered. So how can we make sure that we safeguard pluralism and diversity in this landscape? And then political impact. As journalists, we are under a lot of pressure. We've been attacked physically even during demonstrations. Hate speech is a common problem, disinformation, fake news, and this is dangerous for media pluralism. And in the end, there are economic factors as well. So we know that media companies have different shares in certain companies, and there are very influential parties having shares in the media sector and trying to influence contents in the media. Now, be it Mr. Babic or Mr. Berlusconi, we know that we need to protect our values given those circumstances and dangers that there are, and we need to co-shape that digital revolution. Now, we have a regulatory system that can be complicated, but it also works as a gatekeeper, and we need to make sure that this system is fit for a digital future. The Media State Treaty has done a first step, and in reports coming from the European Union, we have seen that checks and balances is a system that can contribute to this process. And to my colleagues in the European Parliament, I want to say, let's make sure that we have the opportunity to protect our media pluralism and at the same time make sure that there can be harmonization when it comes to consumers' protection, for example, which is also part of the discussed package. But again, democracy is not the same as consumer protection. Well, thank you very much. Today we are talking about the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Now, Ms. Michel, from your perspective as a legal director, what would you say? What can the Digital Services Act do and what are the risks? Well, let's look at the Digital Services Act. We fully support this process. At the same time, we need to say that in some points it goes too far. Now, we have sector-specific regulatory measures. Ms. Kammer-Evert has mentioned it. And there is a directive. Now, a directive gives a minimum standards, but also leaves room for maneuver for member states to regulate on their own. The Digital Services Act is planned as a regulation, and that means full harmonization. That's the first point where I see a strong limitation of national competences, especially in this relationship between media regulation and national competences in this field. Now, in Germany, we have the Media State Treaty, and there has been a conflict already. And this has played a role, but still, it's not clear yet. So it's in the text, and if you look at the reasoning and arguments, then you need to ask, what happens with those cases of infringement against that full harmonization where the audiovisual media directive gives powers to the member states? Ms. Raab just mentioned this. In Germany, we have the Media State Treaty, and I think this is a quite modern step that we have taken. And now the question is, what happens with such an instrument when competences are being changed. And I think Mr. Cole mentioned that we need to set the foundation. And the Media Freedom Act, well, we don't have the text yet, but the MFA also is meant as a full harmonization, as a regulation, and that's the political will behind it. So with all this support, when it comes to the political intention, I need to say this. As Ms. Raab said, in the end, there are well-functioning systems in our member states, for example, in Germany, and I think we have a unique system worldwide where we have the constitutional anchoring of those values. And I see a risk there. This may be harmful for our system. And maybe later we have the possibility to go more into detail. But let's just mention that this is about illegal content, but also about fake news. And this can mean that we reduce diversity in the media because we don't even know exactly what we are talking about. We have a code of conduct, but it's not a legal definition. And so I see a risk there. Providers may have editorial content of public broadcasters, for example, and they need to comply with the law, of course. And it may happen that those contents, in the end, will be taken out by providers. Well, this is a very interesting question, and we will talk about that more. Now, before I ask Ms. Herold about it, I would like to include Mr. Schmidt as a representative of the regulators. What would you say? Would you say that the DSA will have the primary position?
Thank you for the invitation to start with, and I cannot imagine a better point in time to discuss this question. And this question is very difficult to answer. We have to say two things to start with, and I agree with Ms. Kammer-Evert. The EU, as of course, is the appropriate body to define a framework of rules for intermediaries. And we have to find a link between freedom and rules. And I support the European Union in that ambition. But there's a technical detail I would like to draw your attention to. And I agree with what Mrs. Michel said, but one thing we must have in mind, we talk about regulations and not directives anymore, and this is a problem because this has immediate legal effect. But there is a reason for that. The European Commission tries to implement a way of lawmaking which has an impact on companies having being established outside the Union, and this is important. And it's all the more important to find appropriate rules. And there is not just one pink elephant we have to clarify between the Union and the member states. Is this media relevant? Is this media or not? The Commission says what the whole fuss is about. It's not about media, it's about platforms, it's about the European economic area and so on. This regards the DSA. And we say no, the things you regulate have an impact on media, and therefore fall under the competence of the member states. So it has not been clarified whether platforms are media and vice versa. Everybody has defends one's own position, but this has to be clarified, and then we can clarify the rest. Or we recognize, and this is our approach, we recognize, okay, Facebook, Google, YouTube is more than a legal body. So we must make sure that we find rules which allow the member states to safeguard their own system of media regulation. So if I wait for the opportunity to explain what the problem is under the regulator's point of view.
Well, thank you very much for that input. Now, we've heard quite a lot about the European Commission or directed to the Commission. Now, I would like to know what your perspective is on that. Ms. Harold, would you say that it is necessary to redact the Digital Services Act the way it's being done?
Thank you very much for having me with such a distinguished lineup of speakers. It's an honor indeed. I think that I would like to start going back to the last slide of Professor Kohl, where he was trying to portray the different elements of or regulatory pieces, that can have an impact on the media environment. And if I understood him well, also to show how they interact with each other. And if you have asked me about the Digital Services Act, but of course the Media Freedom Act has been, I think, mentioned by all the speakers, so I have to say something about it. So what I want to clarify up front is that as we see the upcoming Media Freedom Act, this is an additional piece of potential EU legislation that is sector specific. Because while discussing all the initiatives that are already on the table, we have realized that we might not have, for the moment, a full picture on the table, that there are elements that are missing. And that's why I wouldn't put the MFA on the same level as the DSA and DMA, because the DSA and the DMA are really in the middle. While the sector-specific, regulations at the EU level, including the upcoming proposal, by the way, on political advertising, these are sector-specific rules that we see very much as interacting very closely together with the competences and with the media laws of the member states. We actually see them very much in symbiosis, so we don't see any contradiction. So, to be honest, I'm not convinced by the red light for the MFA, but of course it will become only clear when we put it on the table. So I understand the worries as such, but I wanted to pass that message. And another thing that I wanted to say is that it is, of course, good that we are having a discussion about competences, and it has always been the case, for any piece of legislation that impacted media in the EU. But it's also a chance to export certain regulatory models. So I just wanted to remind everyone that the original Television Without Frontiers directive was a chance to export a certain model of cultural diversity, at the time championed by France, to the European level. And that the Media Freedom Act, as we see it, could be a chance for the indeed great German model that Ms. Rapp has described so well, that it could be transported to the EU level. So this is, I would say, the political, background for the MFA. I don't know, we will certainly have a chance to go more in detail. So I still have a lot to say, but this is what I wanted to give you as an introduction.
Vielen Dank für den Moment.
Media Freedom Act. For that, the Media Freedom Act, we'll discuss it later on. But Mr. Kohl, I would like to include you in the panel. We've heard quite a lot about possible problems. What is your perspective, Mr. Grevening? would you say that with these large platforms, we need fragmented member states, or is it a problem that needs to be dealt with in a unified way?
I think we actually have to separate the theoretical approach from the practical approach. For a business, it's important that at the end of the day we have a regulation which makes sense. Of course, we welcome the ambitions highlighted in DSA and DMA. I think this is a major opportunity for the next 10 years to have a clear legal framework, including for us as a company, to achieve a level playing field, at least in theory, with regard to the platforms. And the topics which are being dealt with are part of the DNA of media companies. Mr. Cole has said this very clearly in very nice terms, including other fields which do not fall under classical media regulation, for example, data protection, data security, and some economic aspects which are addressed in DMA, for example, data, and these are very essential aspects. So both sets of rules for us are a major chance to find a reasonable framework, but they are also a danger. The danger is that we might find dysfunctional results. And we see this, for example, in the field of monitoring and supervisory bodies. The Medienstaats, or the Media State Treaty, is the result of 10 years of work, this German legal framework for electronic media, and is a very important set of rules, which may not be perfect. We may need to improve some aspects, and also the competition law we have in Germany is very, very efficient. When the solution on the European level is that the European platform regulations can block certain things we do in Germany or cannot work because European bodies cannot deal with tens of thousands of claims, then this will not be helpful for us as a company. So we have to ask whether the side effects and consequences we are afraid of can be corrected. And for DSA, this means a refocusing on the platforms and on the regulation of platforms and liability questions and improve liability. But in the Parliament, we have a long and comprehensive discussion on the general compatibility of advertising. So we understand that there are problems, political advertising. We see that there are problems to be solved, but the platform regulation, we have two regulation projects for platform regulation, which are very important, but we do not want to end in platform protectionism.
Thank you very much. So you're saying that you agree on the necessity to have an instrument to regulate this landscape, but at the same time, you are worried about a possible risk for existing structures, or also about going beyond existing competences. What about second control? That is a topic that has been discussed quite a lot. So large players, let's say Facebook, should they double check on media content before disseminating it, knowing that media companies already control that content? So some of you have said there shouldn't be a second control. Why is that? Ms. Raab. Well, the question is who should regulate or control what and in which way. In Germany, we have ARD, ZDF, Mr. Grevenich is also a representative of many media companies. And so we have 4 voluntary mechanisms of self-control, and we have our press code. So I don't think that we need to be worried about the content coming from official media. We have the Media State Treaty, and this is a quite strict framework. It's also very complicated. When I talked to the Commissioner Jourova about it, I tried to explain this complex system that we have, and she looked at Mr. Cole's publication and said, it's like the Bible. And we really tried to underline the advantage of national competences in media monitoring and the concerns when this is being done by a central authority as a digital content coordinator. And then what is going to happen? So would that be the German network agency, a regulator for the energy grid, or would that be our legal department? So this would lead to less pluralism and less diversity. So let's have a look at other fields. Ms. Harold, so if a country wants to phase out coal quicker than other countries in the European Union could hinder that country to become climate neutral before others. So that is why we want to ask the European Commission, the Parliament, and the Council to allow us to safeguard pluralism and diversity more than you could do in a centralized way with the system, the complex system that we have. And that I understand that you want to protect common values. But let's make no mistake here. The European Court of Human Rights has mentioned their concerns, and I understand those. But, you know, systems in Austria, Greece, Spain, Scandinavian countries, Eastern European countries, we all have different systems. So we need a minimum harmonization to protect consumers' rights and so on. That's correct. But if you want to protect democracy more and pluralism more, you should be able to do that. Now, Ms. Harold, your name was mentioned, so maybe you would like to answer that.
With pleasure. So this is indeed our intention. First of all, it has been said many times in the introduction by Professor Cole, whenever the European Union attempts to regulate media, because media regulation is not an easy task, as many here know very well, it takes obviously the internal market perspective, because this is what we have at our disposal. No, as Professor Cole explained, I think, and the study explains more in detail very, very well. So we will only look at those elements where we think that there are some issues with the functioning and the integrity of the internal market for media. And we see them in 2 areas for the moment. We see them both in terms of regulatory issues or regulatory fragmentation as regards certain laws that may be relevant for media. And we see them also in terms of instances of interference in the media. And, here we can discuss, but I think everybody is aware of what is happening in the European Union, in certain media markets, in terms of direct interference by the state. But there are also issues around private interference. And there are also issues that have been already mentioned today that relate to the role of platforms that have become true public spaces and, have an incredible impact on exposure of people to media plurality, or actually the lack of such plurality online. So these are the issues where we see, because we think that these issues of interference have also a direct impact on the functioning of media companies, on their ability to invest across borders, operate without restrictions in media markets. So this is why we are looking at them. But we will tread very lightly. So I can assure you that we will not throw the baby with the bath. And I think it was once mentioned by Ms. Kammer-Evert at the very beginning of this discussion in the Parliament, because we really understand what is at stake. And it is certainly not the intention of at least my department and the European Commission to disturb the well-functioning system such as the German one. And with that, my second point, and I'll try to be brief, is that whatever we'll put on the table, and this is a little bit also responding to the worries that were previously also expressed by Ms. Michel, we will certainly put in place something which is principle-based, because I think it is unrealistic that in an area such as media regulation, we can regulate every single aspect. And that brings me to my third point, which is that we are strong believers in this wonderful institution of independent media regulation. And we also think that a lot in terms of harmonization or regulatory convergence can be achieved by cooperation of media regulators. And I think that this will be crucial, and probably this will also distinguish this initiative from many others typical internal market instruments, that have a lot of substantive harmonization in them.
Ja, also das Kind nicht mit dem Bade ausschütten.
Well,
Frau Kammer-Evert,
yes, the baby in the bath.
Wie sehen Sie oder wie wird in dem Europäischen Parlament das ganze
So,
Thema zweite Kontrolle diskutiert?
what do you think about second control? Well, yes, I'm afraid that that's what we're doing right now. We have our position in regards to the DSA, and the German federal states have the same opinion. So if we have the clear structures regulating the media landscape, we cannot then have Facebook and others deciding whether we are allowed to see that or not, or whether that's possibly fake news or not, because this content has already undergone a monitoring process. So the private sector can have no second control over that. So the question then is, what do we need to do? Well, there are existing instruments to regulate this media landscape, and a democratic society has to learn how to deal with different types of content. And then, of course, there are those states that you have already mentioned where there is no media freedom right now, where it's being said that in Poland, for example, you have national bodies regulating media contents and that you need to do something about that. And then I must say, what do you want? Do you want that Facebook and others will then solve the problems in Hungary and Poland that we are not able to solve in the European Union, making sure that they adhere to the common values like media freedom and media diversity? that cannot be their role, the role of Facebook and others. So I do see a significant problem here. When we said that there shouldn't be such a second control, that's what we had in mind. And, well, you know, speaking of monitoring and control, in the DSA, it's not clear what the relationship between different regulating bodies would be. And I'm wondering what the Commission will decide, what they are going to do with many cases of infringement that may come up. You know, what is going to happen? Will there be fines? What's the consequence of an infringement? So how can we do this without political influence? How can we make sure that there can be national control? We have ERGA playing an important role here. And to then have a second control body, a national body that, you know, may be coming from the state, like the legal department, let's say, then I'm really worried if you know, when I hear that Facebook and others should then control those contents. Well, Mr. Schmidt and others, you can all say something about that later. But Ms. Michel, what about the content coming from media companies like Russia Today? Ms. Kammer-Ewert just said there are possibilities already. So maybe you can further elaborate on that. Because, of course, some say that if you have that exemption for media companies, then this may become a loophole. Well, of course, Russia Today is one of the examples that we've heard quite a lot about. And they have a license for English-speaking services, and I'm sure that we can do something about that situation. Now, editorial responsibility may be a broad concept, but we have a compromise on the table that there shouldn't be any second control for this type of content coming from a well-functioning, well-monitored system in one of the member states. And I do see a risk here if we ask Facebook to do that for us. Now, there may be individual global players where we need something like that, but with the rules we have here in Germany, I don't see the necessity for that. We have all the necessary instruments at hand. Another question is, how can you define a well-functioning media control? In Germany, this may be easy, but in other member states, it may be more complicated. And that's the point here. So, Mr. Schmidt, do you think that the German lens cannot explain the entire perspective?
No, I don't think so. Maybe I can try to share my view as an executive body with you. So, if you listen to what Anne Herold said, the Media Freedom Act is a different construction site. So we should leave this aside. There may be some difficult points in this regard, but we have to wait for the project the Commission will present. And I'm sure that there will be very good aspects. Russia Today, Germany, has no license to broadcast because of the great cooperation of the German media supervisory body with Luxembourg. So we had a case in the European context which concerned us, and we could find a solution in this because we were allowed to apply German law. And in the German law, and the court in Luxembourg said, okay, if German law says that governmental influence and state influence on media must be excluded, then German law applies. The second point I would like to make, and I fully agree with Mrs. Michel and Mr. Grevenig, is the so-called second control. I understand the intention. The intention under the European perspective is that we have many different countries which have no functioning system of media regulation or media control. So let us agree on some minimum requirements with regard to platform regulation. I understand this, but under the German point of view, this is a disaster because this would lower our level of protection of diversity. We have a well-functioning system of monitoring. We have the Media State Treaty. We have a whole set of tools which works quite fine. So it's difficult to understand why we should have a private company look into this on the second control level, because this entails the danger that a business would be in the position to not only to delete but to suppress content, which is important in the democratic context. So I'm quite skeptical. I think there must be an opening clause in this DSA clause, because if we need sort of a green card for a certain type of content. Let me come to my third point, and this goes to the core of your question, the effective supervision and monitoring. The Digital Services Act has the following super proposal. Mrs. Raab has already addressed this. Each nation nominates a digital service coordinator. I suggest the Federal Media Agency. And 27 of these coordinators will be sitting in one body, plus the European Commission. And then the Digital Service Act, that's the project of the Digital Service Act, then every cross-border case will be discussed by this body. And short version, the Commission will decide what's going to happen. Super idea. Under two prerequisites. If the cases have pan-European importance and if the cases are convergent, that is to say that more than one field of competition is concerned. But this is not the reality. The reality is that out of 100 cases, I find on my table, 100 out of 100 cases concern just media law, and they are never pan-European, they're only bilateral. I may have a problem with a platform in Cyprus or with a platform in Ireland. So I don't need the opinion of 23 other players. And the essential point is the following. In Germany, for 8 years, since 8 months, we follow infractions of existing law in the World Wide Web using artificial intelligence. And this has led to the situation where we have identified 13,000 cases in the last 8 months with 1,700 infractions of the law with a cross-border character, always on a bilateral basis. And when I extrapolate, I come to 10,000 cross-border cases per year. And the idea that I will have to discuss 10,000 cases in operational business in a board with 27 nations which have to discuss 10,000 cases and then make a decision, I think this is absolute madness. This can only be an error. I think what the Commission had in mind is a different case of overarching problems in the convergent context, but the text we have under hand means that everything which is cross-border, and in the internet most cases are cross-border, this new body will have to discuss with the power to decide just with the European Commission, and the Commission certainly is a very competent administration, but it's not non-governmental. So I think this is an intrinsic failure, an intrinsic error. Of course, the DSA covers a lot of areas, not just media, but I think we have to correct this aspect. And I'm very happy to hear that the Federal Republic of Germany has made a statement on the Digital Services Act with a protocol declaration expressing their major concern and asking to do away with this problem. Because, let me say this in very short terms, for Europe this wouldn't make sense, because this part the Commission never had intended, in my view, will be able to cope with this challenge. So the only effect will be that we will all have to say, okay, Brussels again has failed. And this would be sad, because the fundamental idea of the DSA and DMA are quite good, and we need these tools, but we must do away with the failures and problems. So we have to look into the secondary control, and we have to look into the effectiveness of supervision, because the solution is so simple. The European regulatory bodies see Russia today are already working quite well on the bilateral level, or with the ERGA as coordinating body. We have a memorandum of understanding. Everybody knows what to do, and it works. Sometimes better, sometimes not so good, but it works, and it would be very sad if we did away with this achievement. This was my response.
Well, thank you for this input coming from practical work life. Now, we've just heard that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and Mr. Schmidt also mentioned this. Do you think that we need to be more open here?
I think that I need to take a little bit step back and a bit try to explain. Of course, this is not my direct responsibility, so I will do my best. What is the actual objective of the enforcement and oversight system that has been put forward with the Digital Services Act proposal, and what is its relationship with the existing enforcement structures, in particular as regards media regulation? It is certainly not the objective to transfer this sheer number of cases that was just quoted by Mr. Schmidt to the European level, because of course it is first of all, it would be unworkable simply out of staffing reasons, but secondly, and more importantly, and this is really linked to this main point that you also mentioned, which is the fact that it should not be up to the Commission to take content decision. It would really not be for the Commission to take content-related decisions. This would contradict our belief that I already stated in the principle of independence in media regulation. So the idea, as we see it, of the oversight system is really to give competences to as the member states now also want, more and more to the Commission. Before it was the structure that was proposed in the Digital Services Act. Now, indeed, in the negotiations, we hear voices that want to give more responsibility to the Commission in this regard, for the systemic regulation issues over platforms. And there is certainly not an intention to, let's say, impede what works well. We welcome very much the effectiveness of certainly certain media regulators in Europe in trying, to deal with the sheer number of issues in the online environment. And this was also something that we enabled media regulators to do with the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, that now, it was mentioned in the beginning in the introduction already, that now also media regulators can, provided of course that the national legislations already transposed the new audiovisual media rules, can regulate online platforms. So I think that this is very important to know. I understand that there still might be, especially giving very complex competence structure in terms of media regulators in Germany some issues as to the role of media regulators in the oversight at the European level in the systemic regulation of platforms. But at the same time, I think that it has to be clear that there is a clear possibility for the two to coexist. And on the contrary, what we would like to do with the Media Freedom Act is to reinforce the existing media regulators, not in terms of their independence, because this has been already done with the audiovisual media rules, but in terms of the tools they have also to work together even better at the European level, including cases such as the one that has been handled for the moment on a purely informal and bilateral basis, the one that was quoted many times here, Russia Today, between Germany and Luxembourg. And that maybe leads me to the second point, which is about the secondary control of, let's say, media regulated content. I think that here, maybe it is also, the current text has to be looked a bit closer. While I understand that there is a tension always between private and public enforcement of media regulation, which is in a way inherent in view of the role of big online platforms and content moderation. And I think Europe is doing a lot in order to shift the focus from purely private, uncontrolled enforcement to public enforcement. It is also probably unrealistic to think that we can shift it completely back to the public oversight in Europe, and there has to be some sort of mechanism where those players that have become unfortunately very important can talk to media regulators, and I'm pretty sure that the co-legislators will find a very good solution for such a mechanism to put in place to ensure to reassure that that we can have let's say those types of content online that we think that should be online, because this is in the end the end objective of media regulation, to have this fine balance between freedom of expression and protection of certain interests.
Herr Grevenich, direkt dazu. Sie
Mr.
haben die Hand
Grevenich,
gehoben.
you were raising your hand.
Genau, ja, ich hatte die Hand gehoben,
Exactly.
auch um die Perspektive von uns nochmal
I wanted
einzubringen.
to share our perspective with you. 3 points. First, I think for secondary control, we do not need to explain this in detail. The public broadcasters and private broadcasters have the same interest. Don't make a difference in terms of journalism. Of course, we support this objective. Second point, a great thank you to Mrs. Kammer-Evert and her colleagues in the European Parliament, especially in the CULT Commission. They have discussed this topic because we saw that it was very difficult to find understanding for our interests in other areas. So it's very important that you and your colleagues have succeeded in opening a debate on these questions. But I would like to come back to what Hannah Harold has said. What are we talking about? We talk about content, which is editorial content and is under supervision and monitoring. And we talk, on the other hand, about platforms which distribute all sorts of content. The Commission has failed to make a clear distinction between platform offerings and broadcasters with regard to liability for content. Is this content or is this something different? Our proposal was that we need a new category, sort of an over-curated content, which would have allowed for exemptions for journalistic content and other types of content. So, if we pick up the ideas we have discussed, maybe in the future process and the trilogue, we can try to pick up this good intention of the Commission to have a joint view on different types of platforms and allow for the discretionary powers of the member states. Maybe we can find a compromise. Maybe we can classify platforms in a different way, where we can ask ourselves, is this platform under the terms of DSA a very large online platform or not? Are other platforms to be looked at in different ways to prevent a process we already had after the AVB, where we said that when it comes to execution and enforcement of the measures, after several years of discussion, for example, about video sharing platforms, then we get a new discussion on the national level, where the biggest platform is established on the state territory of the relevant member state. So it's good to have a joint and common view to discuss questions of allocation and of interpretation, but the matters of enforcement of purely national relevance still must be remain under the control of the supervisory bodies of the member states. I think this is a direction to which the process could go.
Ms. Kammer-Evert, what would you say about that? Well, I agree with Mr. Grevenich 100%. But I also wanted to get back to what Ms. Herold said. The editorial content, okay, that's on one side, and I have already shared my opinion on that. But Ms. Herold, all of us who have spoken so far have tried to explain that we urgently need a clear definition of what the relationship between these regulations and regulatory tools that are sector-specific in the media landscape will be. And I think we've just heard it very clearly. There is a gap, a regulatory gap, and on the one hand, we have the media control and supervision, and on the other hand, on the other side, we have the DSA. So when it's not audiovisual content, will that still be in the scope of action for those digital coordinators at the national level, or will it stay where it belongs? Stay with the experts who know about that kind of media. Here we need a clear definition, making sure that DSA and DMA do not have to do with that, have a clear definition of that relationship with digital content and the supervisory authorities. And in the course of negotiations, we need to define clearly who is in charge of what and who controls what and implements that law. And I think that's basically what we've all been trying to say and to direct to the Commission. And I've already explained that to the European Parliament as well, but I'm not sure if I've been successful. Ms. Raab, are you also raising your hand? Well, I would like to add something to what Ms. Kammer-Evert just said. So the Broadcasting Commission of the Federal States in Germany that I represent, for us it's important to get those definitions just mentioned. Here in Germany, we have this body with clear resolutions, and we have been following up on this process. Now, in Germany, the federal states are in charge of media legislation, and I think it's important to show what the necessary foundation is for us, and we hope that this is going to be the basis for what you're going to decide on the 25th of November. And we would also like to underline our successful systems. We are working with incentives here. And Ms. Harold, you also talked about enforcing something. And we want to have a strong position. And looking at the decisions by the German parliament and our authorities, we hope that you'll keep those in mind as well. Ms. Harold, I would also like to ask you this. What about the control of media content? So we were saying that it should be independent, and we've also heard that there are existing national structures that shouldn't be undermined. And we've heard how many cases are cross-border but may not have international relevance in that sense.
Thank you. With all due caveats that, as you know, I am not the owner of the Digital Services Act proposal in the Commission. That there are other services that are responsible. So we are of course collaborating with them, but we are not negotiating, and we have of course not written the proposal ourselves. But I can, from my very, how should I put it, modest understanding, what I can try to clarify again is that the Digital Services Act proposal in its institutional architecture, so its enforcement structure, is clearly thought, and of course it is evolving now, as we also heard. The member states in the Council are discussing and have some ideas also as regards this enforcement architecture, which broadly speaking give an even bigger role to the Commission in this enforcement. It is certainly fought for systemic regulation of platforms, in particular very large platforms. This has also been explained. And it is also important to note that the Digital Services Act, since it covers so many issues, is content agnostic. So the idea is not to go into concrete cases of regulation of whether this particular piece of content should be there, whether this service is in breach of certain media law principles that we have also harmonized at the EU level, as it was, of course, mentioned many times, including for the online platforms for audiovisual issues. So this is, of course, it has to be clear that what we have managed is to cover video sharing platforms among this big number of players, but we all know that these are mostly concerned in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So as we have thought about the systems, the two systems, the system of media regulation that is harmonized by the audiovisual media rules and the DSA system that came second with its specific rules for for handling of illegal content, but also for content moderation and also certain specific due diligence obligations on very large platforms as regards risk mitigation that they can pose to society. All of this was supposed to be complementary, and one should not, how should I put it, one should not exclude the other. And I think that this probably hearing the discussion today is not clear enough. So what maybe indeed can be done is providing some additional clarifications to the current text so that this becomes a bit clearer. But I don't think that that there is a fundamental conflict between the two, and the two can also, in my modest view, work very well with each other in the future.
kann mal an der Stelle vielleicht noch mal kurz Professor Kohl
And I would like to include Professor Kohl again.
Sie hatten ja auch
You had mentioned in your presentation that there are legal concerns when it comes to enforcing the law and when it comes to monitoring. I'm not sure if that's going to be possible to include Mr. Cole again. It looks like it. Yes, you're here. So go ahead, please.
Thank you. I follow this discussion, this high-level discussion, with great interest. It's not so easy given the complexity of the questions under study here. But when the DSA came about, we had lengthy discussions on whether the horizontal approach is suitable when we talk about when we consider enforcement, because the DSA regulates so many different aspects, and the focus was not that also the distribution of content is regulated, but of course the DSA does it, but we didn't have this in our focus because it was all about rogue traders, marketplaces, traceability, and so on. And of course, when it comes to market regulation, there are different focuses and aspects, but today's discussion focuses on the question whether the media sector and media monitoring, under a very broad understanding, that is to say the area of distribution of content, is also concerned. And it's more than also concerned. We do not want to live in a situation where the DSA overrules the other provisions we have in Germany. If the DSA is adopted like it in its current version, and we end up with proceeding at the European Court of Justice, then we may be in a situation where the Court of Justice says, well, practically this is a regulation, so it overrules national law. And here, my opinion is I agree with what Mr. Schmidt said. Even if there are not 10,000 cases to be discussed by the board, which is chaired by the Commission, even if there are just a couple of leading cases, we still have the problem of the non-governmental nature of media monitoring we want to safeguard. And we see the danger that there are a handful of leading cases. But the day-to-day business, the 10,000 cases mentioned by Mr. Schmidt, it's on this level that we can achieve a change. So the structure of supervision, if we stick to the existing model and if we stick on the horizontal approach of the DSA, we either need a carve-out for certain types of content, or we need a very strong clarification of how this regulation overrides existing regulations. So it would be so easy to say DSA regulates everything excepting media, and we need a special regulation for media. I understand the approach which was taken 2-3 years ago, because platforms dominate digital content. So the question is how to deal with platforms. But now I've come to a point where I say, maybe it would have been better to make a clear distinction between platforms and media, knowing that the clear dividing line between content distribution and media is not so easy to define.
Thank you very much for that input. So that's the elephant in the room we've heard about before, that sometimes it's not as easy to determine what is editorial content and what's other type of content. Now, from the broadcaster's perspective, Ms. Michel, when it comes to law enforcement, what would you say? Now, what's important here? Our structures in the member states should not be controlled by European structures being put on top of that. As we've already heard, we have a very sophisticated, well-functioning monitoring system. We also have public regulatory bodies. We have non-governmental bodies. So this is already a very sophisticated structure that we would like to maintain. It's working well. And we don't want to see it undermined by a centralized system at the European level that is being put on top of our existing and successful structures. So that's the most important point, I'd say. Mr. Schmidt, your association will play an important role. You mentioned different tools that you work with to structure this complex landscape. When it comes to really designing that tool, would you be able to be in charge of that supervision?
That's a good question. I would say we can do it better than the European Commission, which doesn't have an apparatus to do so. So the national regulation bodies do not have all the same resources. We are in a very comfortable situation in Germany, in France, and in Italy with very clear structures. I think that with or without DSA, we would come into a situation where the ERGA in itself and the question how can we manage this should be strengthened, and sooner or later we would have to ask the European Union to make resources available. But the problem is not so much Germany, France, and Italy, but we have a couple of member states who are the state of establishment of platforms, but who do not have very elaborated supervisory structures and bodies. I think we can cope with the challenge, and when I consider the speed with which we were able in Germany with the Media State Treaty or with the infrastructure of the media agencies, we were able to proceed and to implement progress. Where from the point where we didn't know what to do, we came to a situation where we can actually act, including the different bodies of law enforcement. I'm quite optimistic that we can do it on a European level, and based on the cooperation with the other 26 regulatory bodies, I can tell you that we have a very strong will and intention to achieve progress. A memorandum of understanding may not be so easy to understand, but it's quite remarkable that 27 agencies, national agencies, have agreed to agree upon procedures, and this is quite remarkable to make sure that we can quickly find solutions to problems. So either the need is very strong or the motivation. But we do not want to have to live with a bureaucratic monster.
A bureaucratic monster, Ms. Raab, I think nobody wants that. We've heard of your concerns that there may be structures coming that will make everything more complicated. So what about supervision? What's important here? Well, when it comes to the supervision, as I said at the beginning, we need to safeguard pluralism and diversity. So, we need an intelligent media supervisory authority, and we need also diversity in supervision. That's very important. The Media State Treaty has set a milestone Europe-wide. We've achieved so much with its stipulations against discrimination, for protecting our youth, and so on. And I'm sure it still can be improved, but when it comes to pluralism, we will always have to further develop our structures. But hey, this is not the Champions League anymore. This is the World League. So from the start on, we've chosen a different mechanism. The Media State Treaty has been elaborated with the participation of different parties, online actors, different agencies, and this is why it is being broadly accepted. And you need that wide acceptance as a foundation, also that acceptance coming from media companies. And you know, you should never change a running system, but in this case, the system is not only running, it's running well. And so you could use this as a catalyst for this European process of how you can create well-working regulatory structures so that in the end you won't have censorship coming from politicians or governments like we've seen in some countries. We want to make sure that this supervision is non-governmental and independent, because what we are protecting here is of utmost importance. And I'm sure the Council can only be convinced by this. Thank you very much, Mr. Grevenich. What's your final conclusion, your perspective? Ms. Raab just explained what is necessary because of these complex structures. And I think it has become clear again today that we need absolute expertise in order to separate these different elements, to make sure that a regulating body would be able to deal with that when it comes to transparency of platforms, different mechanisms those platforms are using. So what are your final words on that?
I've already said this with my last statement. For us, it's important that the system we will get is actually functioning, because we as a media company are not only competing with other media companies, that is to say with broadcasters, but with internationally active groups, with international groups covering all sorts of communication, including media. And I think these are 2 points we have to achieve after 2 hours of a very good discussion. I think it's really difficult to, it's very difficult not to be able to touch the problems we have with DSA and DMA, because we want to make, of course, we support the intention to regulate liability for platforms. We think we should have a second discussion on this topic. We had hoped to be able to discuss on these aspects and not on discussions on where the supervisory activity could be malfunctioning. Of the major steps we have achieved on the national level with the state treaty should not be jeopardized, because, and this is the discussion we had today. But what Mr. Kohl had said at the beginning is important. We need we urgently need something the German presidency had called a media compatibility check. We need to make sure that policymakers need to make sure that the framework conditions we need for our businesses do not only cover the classical media concerns, but all areas of activity. For example, if we talk about funding, about limitation of advertisement for TV productions, where, for example, we talk about product placement or for advertisement for sweets and so on. So there are a couple of questions with regard to new regulations. We must make sure that for private media businesses, the framework conditions are defined in a way that we can monitor content, but make monitored content available. And we need a leeway to be able to do this. And in all different areas, regulation of the food sector, of the energy sector, really have an impact on limitations we have to suffer. And this is important to take into account. And this is the central aspect I would like to highlight, along with the discussion we had today, and we have to take into account in all regulation attempts.
Thank you very much for that. Now, we've talked about advertisement, we've talked about protecting youth and children. There are so many topics. We won't be able to talk about all of them. Now, Ms. Kammer-Ewert, what would you say? What are the next steps? Maybe you can tell us about what's coming next. Well, the Cultural Committee, unfortunately, will not be able to actively participate in the negotiations because we were not able to claim rights for our committee. So in these coming weeks, a decision will be made, and the committee will probably decide to enter into cross-sector negotiations. That's administrative step, and then we enter into the trilogue. And I'm very thankful for the declaration coming from the German government and the German federal states, because it clearly shows that there are certain issues in the media sector that need to be addressed. We've heard from France, who will soon take over the EU presidency, and apparently there is a strong political will to implement at least one of these instruments fairly quickly. That's probably because elections are coming up and Macron wants to show what is possible when it comes to regulating large platforms. If, in the end of the day, that's going to be possible, the way the French Council presidency would like to see it, well, future will tell. Now, there are many questions that we still need to deal with, and I hope that the future German government will show an influence in these negotiations, because we need clear definitions and certain changes to the text, and I hope that this can be done in the course of the trilogue. Thank you very much. These important issues that still need to be discussed, I think we've mentioned them several times here in this very exclusive panel. We've also heard different perspectives from our panelists, and I would like to thank you all for your participation in this panel. I would also like to thank Ms. Herold, who was addressed several times throughout this event. And I would also like to thank all of our viewers. Now, unfortunately, there were no questions in the chat. I hope that it's not due to a technical issue, but that you just got all the information you were looking for. Sometimes it has been quite complex what has been discussed here, but we've also heard good solutions, and I thank you for that and wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you.